Hello again. This lesson is on analyzing failures, and it is a crucial component of the second chapters of your policy analysis. The point here is to begin to look at ways that people have tried to solve this particular problem in the past, or similar problems in the past, and to analyze the extent to which these efforts have succeeded or failed in order to focus on what you can do to mimic the successes of these earlier programs and to avoid the failures of these earlier programs. The first step is to look at your client's goals. What are your client's goals in this particular issue? First of all, what are their broad goals? What kinds of regional and international issues do you have? So, for example, in the model that I gave you at the beginning of the class on the Kashmir, the broad goals included regional stability, democratization, and avoiding a tactical nuclear exchange. But there will also often be very specific outcomes that clients want to see. Your client is a shareholder in a particular issue, and there are going to be specific changes that the client wants to see as a result of implementing the policies. And so you need to be dealing with those kinds of issues as you move forward. As you look at each effort to implement a policy change, then you want to ask a set of questions about the goals. The first question is, which goals were achieved? So of this set of goals that you've identified, which efforts to solve the problem achieved which goals? Which outcomes were achieved? That is, what kinds of measurable benchmarks of success actually occurred as a result of the policy changes? And finally, what unintended consequences occurred? Often, programs that are otherwise in excellent condition fail because, although they met their outcomes and their goals, unexpected things arose that were not intended. I mean, on a big scale, we can just think of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan under Carter and Reagan and the last year of the Bush administration, where what we're looking at is a set of an incredibly successful intervention in terms of our specific goals, which were to, in Zbigniew Brzezinski's words, give the Soviets their own Vietnam. But the unintended consequences were astonishingly dire, culminating with 9/11 in the United States. The next issue to consider is physical obstacles that got in the way of project success. So here you're asking the question, what specific physical or environmental hazards interfered with the project's success? The next thing that you want to ask about is time. What kinds of temporal issues got in the way? So the temporal question is, what was the schedule across which the plan was to be implemented? And you want to list the key milestones. What pieces of the plan were supposed to be put into place by what dates? And then you want to ask what actually happened on the ground in relationship to the plan. Did people meet the deadlines? Did they meet their target goals? Or were there time overruns so that people missed deadlines, and then did this cause further consequences down the line? What you want to do is list all of the differences between the intended and actual dates of implementation so that you can analyze this set of failures. And then you want to look at what unforeseen events occurred that disrupted the scheduled implementation. That is, why are there differences? And how did these cause the plan to fail on the temporal dimension? And again, you're trying to analyze these so that you don't make the same kinds of mistakes. Then there's the issue of resource quality. Every policy project that goes forward necessarily involves some kind of resources, whether this is money, land, people. There are resources involved, and money is the most common one in contemporary kinds of policy recommendations. So the first thing that you ask is, what resources were originally planned in order to implement a particular policy project. And then you want to ask what resources were actually implemented as opposed to those that were planned. And what were the consequences? So if it was estimated that it was going to cost X number of dollars and Y number of dollars were committed, were there consequences to this? Usually, underfunding is a problem. That takes us to budget. What were the original estimated costs of the project? And then, in order to, you want to specify those. And then you want to ask what were the actual costs and expenditures. What actually happened on the ground in relation to the budgeted costs? And you want to list the progress that the plan made against the economic goals and limits that it ran into. The next step is project planning. This involves asking, who was responsible for planning a particular project, asking whether the project was clearly defined from the beginning. Did they know what their goals were? Did they know what specific measurable outcomes they were seeking to implement? Was there an actual written plan, and how detailed was it? Once you have details on the plan articulated, then you can start asking questions and evaluating its success or failure. So you want to ask, was this plan a good one? If so, what was good? What was missing, if anything? Was the plan realistic? Was it too idealistic, or did it really, think about what kinds of problems could occur on the ground? Were they taken in at the planning stage? How did the plan evolve over time? What kinds of changes were made and why? And if changes were implemented, were these changes effective or ineffective, and why? And ultimately, how did these changes affect the overall outcomes of the project? The next key issue to pay attention to is implementation, taking it from the planning stage and implementing it on the ground. So the implementation questions include, who was charged with implementing this project? Was there some kind of a ministry, some kind of an agency, some kind of outside subcontractor? Who was supposed to actually implement it? And how well did they do this work? So, for example, we had a group one time that was looking at water management of the Jordan River as their policy project. And one of the things that they looked at was the particular kind of multinational agency who had authority to make recommendations about how the Jordan River should be used. And so they were examining the structure and makeup of this group, and one of the things that they came to a conclusion about was that the group charged with implementing the water management project was not effective, and so there was implementation was a bigger problem than actual policy itself. And so their projects actually continued a number of existing policies, but they changed entirely the way that they recommended the countries go forward with implementation. So you're going to ask, how well did it work, what specifically went wrong and why, so that you can avoid this in your own policy recommendations. Next questions concern issues of communication. Within any given project, there has to be careful communication between the various agents charged with getting things done. So the first question is, how is communication between those involved in the project managed, and how well did this system of communication management work? And then secondly, how were changes tracked and communicated, and how well did this work? The next question you want to ask about is politics, the political context in which the project is implemented. And the key question here is, what specific political issues interfered with the successful implementation of the project? So what kinds of intraspecific politics, that is, what kind of office politics, what kind of political struggles were taking place within the project itself, between and among various actors in the project. Then the second question is, what kinds of local political issues played into it? Often, there's a project comes in, it brings in resources, and there are local competitions for those resources. And this can often have detrimental effects on the program, particularly if it's not accounted for in the plan. And then you might want to ask, what kinds of regional political issues came in, and of course what kinds of national political issues impacted the project. And in some cases, we should probably, we need to be asking about international issues as well. The next couple of questions have to do with cultural issues, and you want to specifically think about, the viewpoints of the stakeholders involved. So I had you asking these questions as you were beginning to think about your own projects and doing the research, but now I want to bring that into the failure analysis. So you're going to be asking questions about how the various stakeholders, aside from your client, who we already dealt with under goals and objectives, how did these other stakeholders view the project? And so again, you want to think about local stakeholders. How did they see this project? National stakeholders. How did they see the project? What do they understand the project to be about? What do they understand the project to be doing? Regional stakeholders and international stakeholders. And at every level of these, you need to be thinking about how they were viewed. And then you need to start thinking about how these viewpoints affect people's action. So for each of these four levels, local, national, regional, and international, you need to ask a series of questions. The first is, how did these viewpoints affect people's actions in regard to the project? Secondly, what kinds of actions did they take as because of the viewpoints that they held? And use the answers to these two questions to help assess cultural dimensions of success and failure. So that leads us to our last analytical point, which is social and cultural obstacles to implementation of your policy. And here the key question is, what specific social and cultural obstacles impeded implementation of the project? And much of this data is sort of residue from the viewpoints exercise. Okay, at the risk of making this lesson even longer than it is, I want to apply this directly to your project and talk about sort of key lessons that you are supposed to take away from a failure analysis. And so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be thinking very carefully as you move forward with your own policy recommendations about what went right and about what went wrong. And we'll start with questions that you ask about what went right. And so for you and your and actually writing in your project, you're going to want to summarize in quick bullet points specific things that worked well with the policy efforts that you're analyzing, the policy efforts that took place in the past. And you're going to want to use specific examples wherever possible. And you're going to want to identify which of these points are relevant for your policy recommendation and which of these points don't matter, are specific to the project that you're looking at and won't affect your project. Then you're going to want to turn around and ask the same kinds of questions about what went wrong. You're going to want to summarize in quick bullet points specific things that caused problems with the implementation and planning and resourcing of these prior policy efforts. You're going to try to isolate which specific attitudes, procedures, methods, timing issues, and so forth caused those problems. And you're going to want to identify how those problems could have been overcome. And that allows you then to engage in an analysis of the history of policy implementation on the issue that you're looking at, and to begin to to create a set of specific problems that your proposal is going to avoid. And to forecast what kinds of problems that your proposal would be likely to encounter, and then specify how you would deal with each of these foreseen problems. Okay? So that's the lesson. That's a quick and dirty introduction to failure analysis. At graduate level programs, they have entire courses on this, and I've given it to you very quickly. And you need to do this at the level of depth that's appropriate to your specific project. And now that I've given you the lesson, I would like you to do the usual 3 questions. I've got a worksheet for you to print out and fill out. What did you find most interesting in this particular lesson? What questions did it raise for you that it did not answer? And finally, what is one concrete thing that you took away from this lesson that will definitely apply to your project? And I look forward to seeing you in class.